I think it's time for us to get started. I think I just heard the bell. And we're going to continue our lesson with Based on All Christians Are Leaders by Charles B. Hodge Jr. And this morning we're going to talk about leaders and common sense. And hopefully I don't hear any applause. You guys only have one more week with me, so to say, man, I'm glad that this is over with that guy. So, as my tradition, I'd like to point out a few things as far as setting our minds for class, and I'd like to welcome all the visitors we have this morning too. This is probably the first weekend if we have some college kids rolling in, and we had all of our college kids, I think, pretty much rolled out now. Our hearts. Proverbs 4:23. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. And of course, that points towards the four soils that are mentioned in Luke chapter 8. Pray everyone in here has the fertile soil that's mentioned there in Luke chapter 8. And a way to get this fertile soil, the fertile heart, is Philippians 4:8. And where Paul writes, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. What a wonderful way to set your mind there. And lastly, our prayer for our class. Psalms 139, 23, and 24. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in a way everlasting. What a beautiful thought. Any prayer requests before we go into class? Open up with a word of prayer. Yes, ma'am. Sister Smith with friend Tasha, she has health issues, and she's asking for prayers on that. Robert? Mm-hmm. Prayer for the success of the Durham church ministry that's taking place over at the Durham jail. There are inmates over there who are interested in the gospel and praying that their hearts will be open to what's being stated. And also, I guess if you're going to say their safety, dealing with what they deal with within jail too, and that won't hinder them from hearing God, what he has to say. Anyone else? And also, Bill, remember the college kids who are away, that they will remain faithful while they're at their respective schools, and they will find a good congregation. And also for the ones that would be seeking to come here to the Triangle, that they can find a solid congregation, hopefully us, and they'll stay faithful. Would you please, Bill? Thanks, Bill. I should have mentioned this also, prayers for the college students' parents too, especially the parents that are dealing with their child going away for the first time. That's a pretty trying event, life experience that takes place for their stability, so remember them also. The kids that are their third and fourth one, hey, they just drive by the school and tell the kid tuck and roll as they slow down just enough for them to jump out. So, all right. What we're covering, or have been covering, what is leadership, the elements of authority, and so on and so forth. And this morning, we're to chapter 11, which is leaders in common sense. We might bring in other key words for leaders next week as we close out. It depends on how far we get into the fine art of negotiation, but that's a pretty detailed lesson itself. So don't know if we'll be able to bring in some points from that. But we have been bringing up a lot of those things in other lessons, if you want to say. And just a quick recap for those of you who are new to the class, chapters 1 and 2, we talked about what is leadership. Leadership is influence. It's accountability and responsibility. What leadership is not. It doesn't require brilliance. Common sense is the key, hence today's lesson. It's a function and not a position, and some elements of authority there from chapter 2. It's in God, Jesus, the scriptures, the eldership, preachers and husbands. Rolling over to chapters 3 and 4, leaders in faith, and in chapter 4, leaders in wisdom. But back to chapter 3, faith is not wishful thinking. It's based upon facts. It's not blind. It's not foolishness, irrational. It lives, it's not dead. Then let's just roll over to chapter 4, dealing with wisdom. Leaders must have reasoning skills. And that points back to Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, where we talked about where God stated we have instruction, which leads to knowledge, which should lead to understanding. From understanding, you should be able to gain some wisdom. Then ethics, how you live, and being able to discern both of those things. And that points towards the leader's character, if you want to say. And we also talked about competence. And that rolls us into chapter 5 with competence. That's a point that I just want to bring out from there. And these three positions here from a leadership perspective, and within the church, we have teachers, deacons, and elders. And it's implied competence within the teachers in the sense that they're going to be held to a higher, stricter judgment. And with deacons, they have to prove themselves before they're appointed to the office. And with elders, you can look at their families before they're appointed to a particular office in the sense of they must manage their families well and with all dignity. Then in chapter 6, we talked about leaders and trust. You can see our circle of trust here with God being the center. Leaders must trust the members must trust the leaders, and so on and so forth to complete our complete circle of trust there. Chapters 7 and 8. The servant leader, Jesus is the prime example. Of course, where Jesus washed the disciples' feet, greatest example there is right there. And women as leaders, of course, we're talking about leadership as influence. So that's the point that we're coming from. And we must remember that within Christ, all Christians are equal. But we do have different functions. And back to chapter 1, like I said, leadership is simply influence. And in chapter 9, we talked about how not to be a toxic follower or a toxic servant. And that's engaging in illicit, illegal, and immoral and unethical behavior, failure to join the team you're on. This is taken from a letter that a sergeant major wrote to the United States Army, and I just pulled this in and applied it to the church. And the team here is talking about your local congregation. You have to be part of the congregation that you're part of whenever you show up there, not, hey, back at congregation X where things were so much better and you guys stink over here. That's not the way that you want yourself to be presented when you go to another congregation, a new congregation. Social media is not the place where you vent your concerns about the leadership of the church and allowing disagreement to lead to disloyalty. Just because the leadership doesn't necessarily agree with your ideal doesn't necessarily mean that they hate you or anything of that. Don't take it personal. They might tweak some things or whatnot. So don't take those things personal. And last week, chapter 10, where we talked about poor and bad leadership. On my left, your right, the positive things. This is from Wendell Winkler, where he talks about the servant leader, the one who participates, and also the shepherd there. And you can see the list of the negative things that are listed there. And again, that lesson was presented from the standpoint of if you have the opportunity as a congregation to present people or put them up for deacons or eldership or being part of the eldership, You will know what to look for from their leadership qualities, if you want to say, or their styles. And the negative side is not necessarily what you want to be choosing from. Now, everybody kind of ebbs and flows between some positive and negative things, but you want to be on the positive side. So that leads us into today's lesson, leaders and common sense. Proverbs 3, 21 and 22. My son, let them not vanish from your sight. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, so that they will be life to your soul and adornment to your neck. Them is talking about sound wisdom and discretion and what it will do for you. It will be a light to your soul, common sense. And from that standpoint, we're going to use sound wisdom and discernment as synonyms to common sense, discretion, yes. So that's the mindset we have going forward. So just a few thoughts from the author. Ozzy, you are a tremendous reader. If you would help me out there, can you read the font there? Okay, please.
The first requirement for leadership is character. The second is common sense. Tragically, common sense is uncommon. We must never ignore it.
And we're going to go through the whole slide here, and then we'll come back to each one. Go ahead, Ozzy.
Sin destroys, but stupidity also destroys. Life at its heart depends on common sense. When we advise, go back to basics, we are saying to return to common sense. U.S. politician Adlai Stevenson well said, who leads us is less important than what leads us. The control of attention is the highest individual power. Salt changes everything it touches. Light shines in the darkest dark. The wonder of one snowflake outweighs the wisdom of 1,000 meteorologists. That is the awesome power of truth.
And this is just the author's introduction to leaders in common sense and some of his thoughts there. And Ozzy, if you would continue.
What are our convictions and priorities in life? We ought to write them down, read them, and evaluate them. They determine how we live and how we spend our time. They also set boundaries that protect our relationships and build our lives. If we do not set good boundaries for ourselves, no one else can. We need to have boundaries and honor them. They were made to be kept. Our boundaries determine our choices. Will there be struggles? Yes. We live as imperfect people with other imperfect people in an imperfect world. The only answer is common sense. Instead of giving up over things that are beyond our control, we must use common sense to handle the things under our control. Common sense simply means having some wisdom, exercising good judgment.
That last statement there, common sense simply means having some wisdom, exercising good judgment. Leaders have to have these things. Those who influence people, they have to apply common sense. Some things you can overthink, over-apply, over this, over that. Just some good old-fashioned horse sense, as they say, applies up, down, backwards, and forwards in every day of the week. And I like the way the author introduced the thoughts here in the sense of, hey, these are the things that are needed. And again, this Charles Hodges, he said it took him about 75 years to put this down on paper. So I feel like I'm reading his book. I'm sitting at the feet of someone who's got tons of knowledge, if you want to say. I don't shake a stick at someone who's been preaching the gospel, soundly preaching the gospel and putting it in terms where people can understand it. I don't take that lightly. That man has a lot to say. So, and lastly, I think this is the last one, Ozzy.
Sinners say, don't impose your morality on us. Christians must answer, don't impose your immorality on us. Life in community is a mysterious, complex, sacred thing. Common sense is an answer. Solomon said that common sense, sound wisdom, and discretion will put life into our souls. Proverbs 3:21-22. Common sense must be based on
If you look at that example that the author used here in the sense of immorality being imposed upon Christians, is that not a common sense response to them when they say, don't impose your morality on us? And you turn around and say, well, if we're being fair, you want to look at it that way, don't impose your immorality on me, because you're supposed to be the people of tolerance. But in reality, Christians are the greatest people, or have the greatest level of tolerance there is when it comes to walking the face of the earth. Common sense. You can't say enough about it. Don't make the problem harder than what it is. Yes, Ozzy. Mm-hmm.
Right now, people can't distinguish a boy from a girl, a born baby from, a boy baby versus a girl baby. They're babies now. So when you talk about common sense, it's not common at all. And they really twisted things on its head.
Ozzy said common sense is not so common. We've heard that so many times. And he used the example of a newborn baby that they, kind of don't tell you whether it's a male or female, and that's terms that are wrong, if you want to say. And then you turn around and let a child determine what their sex is. Come on, man. It's my child couldn't. Children, we had to teach them how to tie their shoes. We had to teach them how to walk. And you want them to make a life-altering decision at such a young age? In reality, you just look at biology and say, that's what you are. And so, Johnny. Johnny said he quoted another old adage in the sense of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And he said, God's word is not broken, and it never will be broken. Don't add to, don't subtract, don't modify in any way, shape, or form. His morality is his morality. Actually, he is the baseline. He set what morality is all about. Back to the point of don't impose your morality on me. That's something you made up. And we're all created from God, so he created what morality really is. So you've all been off to the side making your own laws, if you want to say. So some characteristics of common sense. And we're going somewhere with all of this information. Pursues delayed gratification. Not only uses self-control, but also seeks God control. Demands a strong intellect, reasoning skills, excellent character, and profound dedication. Tells us to be bold enough to love. Tells us to be daring enough to serve. Humble enough to submit. And lastly, strong enough to be weak. What does that mean, that last bullet? Strong enough to be weak. Humility. Anyone else? Robert? Robert brings up, he said that this lesson actually works well with Proverbs chapter 18 and the contrasts that are taking place there with humility versus folly, or pride, and wisdom versus folly, and so on and so forth. Strong enough to be weak. Floyd. Floyd mentioned meekness in the sense that you recognize you have strength, but you recognize that God has all the strength, and we need Him in our decision making and so on and so forth. And recognizing we're created from Him, and He holds all knowledge. Hence, we should be listening to Him, and we need each other too. Yes. Our sister said you don't pretend to be strong when you're actually weak in whatever you're dealing with there. My mindset went to a know-it-all, and it's hard to teach someone who knows everything that they feel like they know everything that there is to know. And in actuality, that is a very strong weakness, if you want to say, that they actually have. And in order to really learn, you have to recognize you don't know it all. You have to realize you just don't know, and open to instruction. And if you're open to instruction, back to Proverbs chapter 1, if you're open to instruction, then you're open to knowledge. And then once you gain the knowledge, then you're open to the understanding of the things that have been presented to you. Then you can actually gain true wisdom. You have to be weak in order to. Did you have your hand up, brother? Yes.
When I look at strong enough to be weak, is that you can be strong, but yet are you strong enough to be bold enough to love, to be willing to serve and not let others serve you, to be humble when you've been brought out. That sometimes we can be strong, but we muscular in Scripture, but we have to be able to humble ourselves and lower ourselves to serve and be compassionate with our fellow man.
Our brother tied basically the last bullet to the three above it in the sense of being in your weakness. Are you strong enough to recognize that you're weak enough that you need to love, you need to serve, you need to submit, you need to do all of these things? And back to Floyd's point in the sense of we not only need God, but we need one another. God did not create us to be isolated creatures. He created the family. He created us to need one another, and we really do. We have to lean on one another. Torrance Monteith, would you please read this example here, and we'll come back to this. Continue, please. It's from Genesis 13. Now, we just covered those characteristics a few seconds ago. Characteristics of common sense. Now, with the Abram example we just read, or that Torrance read to us, what was Abram's goal? Peace. Did he exhibit the characteristics to the left? Oh, Miss, I'm sorry. Thank you. Yeah. He was wanting to please God, and one thing he knew what God had told him was going to take place, but he wanted peace with his brother and his nephew. Mm-hmm. He was aiming for unity. This is a great example of conflict resolution, if you want to look at it that way. So, did he exhibit the characteristics to the left? Your left, yeah. Yeah. Pretty much nailed every one of them. Pretty much nailed every one of them. The delayed gratification was down the line. He exercised self-control, and he did it the way God wanted him to do it. He reasoned through this. Abram was an excellent character. He has flaws just like anybody else before everybody starts digging into his backyard and saying he did this, and this. Yes, he was a man. And he had dedication to his family. He loved his family. He served Lot. He submitted to him. And through all of that, he showed he didn't know everything that there was to know. So, hey. Yes, Ozzy.
He also showed the reliance on God and what he tells her. It doesn't seem like he gave any thought to what I was going to be left with.
Right.
It was going to be okay. He was good for that.
Yeah. Ozzy said that he couldn't see the future, and he was okay with what was going to happen, and he was relying 100% on God. Hey, I'm good with this, Bill. He could have had the first choice. Back to that serving piece. He said, "You choose. You choose." And we know how that story plays out on behalf of Lot. Didn't work out as well as what Lot thought it was going to work out. Was Abram the leader in this particular situation? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Now, is there a time for you to stand up, fight for, or use your rights? Do you think there is a time? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So before we get into this here, just a little background. This is taken from Acts 22. In the previous chapter, Paul had been detained by the Roman officials, and there was a riot taking place outside of where he was being held, and he asked the Roman commander, "Could I go out and speak to the Jews here?" And those were the ones that were rioting. And he spoke to them in the Hebrew dialect. That's really key because they thought he was just going to be another guy, and it quieted the crowd down. And then Paul turns around and gives his defense of who he is and so on and so forth. And after he's done that, Robert Warner, would you please?
They listened to him up to this statement. And then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from this earth, for he should not be allowed to live." And as they were crying out and throwing off their clothes and tossing dust in the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging, so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. But when they stretched him out with bonds, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by,
Loosely speaking, without going into too much legal detail, because I'm not a lawyer in any way, shape, or form, it was pretty much illegal to detain a Roman citizen basically without a trial, and so on and so forth. They went and snatched up Paul off the streets, and so on and so forth. And right before he was going to be beaten, he said, "Hey, can you do this to a Roman citizen?" And the guy says, "Oh, wait a minute, let's think about this." And you can see they let him go. Paul stood up for himself in the sense of he allowed his Roman citizenship to set him free. Was this a self-serving thing that he was doing? He was about God's work. If you notice everything that Paul did, and Paul to me is a great, great example of how to conduct yourself as a Christian. Everything that Paul did was about God. Whenever God said, he said, "Hey, I got this thorn in my flesh. Could you take this away from me?" God's response was, "My grace is sufficient for thee." And Paul was good with it. If you look back over his life, like I said, everything that he did, I know he still had to live with the guilt of what he did from beginning at the stoning of Stephen all the way to when his conversion, because he had a good conscience about what he was doing. That's telling you your conscience is not, and it's not the guide for you to do the right things. Clear conscience. But he was provided with more information, and his conscience was cut, and he became a Christian. And from that moment going forward, with the information he had, the right information, he turns around and everything that he does is about God. Everything. Even in this instance, it wasn't about I'm a political prisoner or anything like that. It was about I have to complete my work for God. Common sense demands a conscience. The conscience is not divine revelation, the final authority, or the guaranteed self-guide. It's important to, it's hard to define conscience. So it's the author, from his standpoint, it was important to say what it's not. It's not facts. It's not the voice of God in man. It's not supernatural, it's spiritual, and it's not infallible. Your conscience can make mistakes because it basically works off the information that it has. Pointing back to Paul, they laid their clothing at the feet of Paul because Paul was the authority authorizing the stoning of Stephen. And he did that with a clear conscience. However, he was clear consciously wrong. If you want to look at it that way, he was working off of ignorance, or out of ignorance, if you want to say. Now, we're getting short on time. There's a few more areas that the author brought up about what common sense: solving conflict, keeping commitment, and finding contentment. With this solving conflict, Christianity alone teaches us how to handle conflict. Said Abram's a great example. Paul Barnabas and the John Mark situation, how they handled that situation. With love. They had a contention between them about John Mark, but they didn't whip out their swords and start cutting at one another. They handled it, they went their ways, and they continued the work of God. Our goal is to do the work of God, always. And delayed gratification, our reward is going to be heaven. Everything that we do should be about God. Everything. And it starts with the greatest commandment and leading to the second commandment. Love God with all of your fiber of your being and love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus says, if you love me, as he was talking to his apostles before he went to the cross, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. That's where the commandments come into play. That's telling you your motivation for obeying the commandments. It's not just obeying commandments to be obeying commandments. It's love. It's love for God. And your love will allow you to solve your conflicts properly. Keeping commitments. Those who attend worship service may not be faithful members of the Lord's church. Too many do not wish to have salvation. They simply desire therapy. I thought this was pretty profound here. Too many are not disciples of Jesus, but only wish to feel religious. Too many are not real followers of Jesus, but desire a better life. Too many view 10% contribution as the maximum, not the minimum. Commitment. You want to see someone's commitment, a lot of times, follow the money. Follow their money. That's where you will see what they're committed to. That board out there in the foyer means absolutely nothing to a certain degree. Because your giving, my giving, is between me or you and God. It's an expression of how much you love him. That 10%, you can't view it as a minimum. Absolutely. He said that's why tithing is an Old Testament concept, not a New Testament concept. I'm sorry? Law. Okay. And in the sense of, even with that, the Old Testament can be looked at, or was looked at, as like teaching a child, thou shalt not. You teach children these things, but eventually you start teaching them principles. You're teaching them principles all along, but they don't necessarily understand them. Then those principles help them understand the rules, if you want to say. I think I've been saying this for about 3 to 4 weeks straight. And even before that, you got to teach, you got to understand the principles. Then you understand the rules. The 10%, even in the Old Testament, will make way more sense if you understand the principle of loving God, because he owns it all. Bill. Absolutely. Bill said that this puts him back to the beginning of the lesson where it says setting priorities and boundaries for yourself. In the last example that he used, getting up on Sunday morning, if you have to make a decision on whether you're going or not, in the sense of health, get that. But it's just your normal Sunday and you have to make a decision about whether you're going, you're not committed. You haven't set that as a priority. Back to that point of follow the money. Pretty much follow the money. Yes, sister. Sister just brought up a pretty sensitive topic with some folks, but it needs to be talked about in the sense of people not necessarily wanting salvation, but desiring therapy and not being true disciples of Jesus, but wanting to feel religious. So look around the room in the sense of you see how many folks are here right now for Sunday school, but then when the 11 o'clock hour, the 10:30 hour rolls around, there'll be a whole lot more people in here. Not true enough, there are kids back there in the back. They will fill in some of the gaps. But if you were standing up front whenever you're doing the announcements and so on and so forth, and watch the flow of people who are showing up and even doing the Lord's Supper and so on and so forth. By the time Larry's pretty much done, this place is pretty packed. And as the invitation is offered to watch the number of people who exit the building during the invitation, that's pretty interesting too, to watch all of those things play out. And you're like, where are you going, man? Where are you going? Or where you been? Robert, yes, sir.
Also, too, I think I saw you kind of catch yourself on maybe the issue of health,
Yeah, yeah.
related or not. Um, and this is a challenge to myself because I've been guilty of maybe skipping evening service or something like that, sucking up on Monday to make it work. But am I more concerned about my physical health? Now, mind you, your physical health does affect your mental health, etc. But, or am I concerned more about my eternal health?
Robert said that he saw me kind of hesitate on the health piece, and he said that it comes down to using him as a person, an example. You put yourself out there. But anyways, seriously, Robert said that there are times he skips Sunday evening, but he sucks it up on Monday morning to go to work. And what are you more concerned with, your physical health or your spiritual health? Every Sunday when we're closed, this is a closing thought because I see people out in the foyer. This is spiritual food. This is the bread of life every Sunday. And you have to be doing it on your own too. But this is where you're fed spiritually. Thank you for your time.